They threw her away like a candy wrapper. Still warm, still breathing, still hoping. Beneath the rustling Kansas wind, a 4-month-old golden retriever lay curled in a bed of leaves, too tired to cry, too scared to run. She didn't understand why the car door never opened again, why the voices she trusted became silence. But somewhere across the park, a woman named Grace was walking without a purpose until fate wrapped in golden fur blinked up at her from the earth. Two souls broken in different ways. One moment, one look, and the world quietly shifted. Chapter 1. Where the Wind Hides the Lonely Kansas. In late autumn was a place of quiet whispers. Long grasses bent low beneath the breath of the prairie wind, and the sky stretched on forever like a faded quilt hung too long in the sun. The small town of Fairview, nestled somewhere between forgotten farms and rusting grain silos, had already begun folding itself inward for the winter. Trees stood mostly bare, their last copper leaves spiraling down onto the empty park benches and cracked sidewalks. It was here in the unkempt stretch of Willow Park that something precious lay half buried in the cold, a small golden puppy too still for comfort. She was barely 4 months old, a golden retriever with a pale creamy coat now matted with dirt thistles and rain-soaked leaves. Her belly was bloated not from fullness but from days of hunger. One of her ears was torn at the edge, likely from trying to squeeze under wire fences in desperate escape. She had no collar, no name, only ribs, like piano keys, under paper-thin skin, and eyes that were too big for her face. Eyes that held a question the world had never bothered to answer. Grace Monroe wasn't looking for anything that morning. Not really. She had left her house, an aging one-story cottage on the edge of town with no destination in mind, only a need to move her legs and untangle her thoughts. She was 28, once vibrant and effortlessly kind, with honey-brown eyes and curly chestnut hair that had been chopped short after her accident. It was easier to manage that way. Her gait was slightly uneven, favoring the left leg. The limp was subtle, but it had become part of her rhythm, just like the silence that now filled her home. Grace had once taught at the Fairview preschool, known for her patience with the shyest of children. But after the accident, a pickup truck ran a red light while she was walking home from work. Everything changed. Months of rehab left her physically functional, but the sense of connection she had with the world evaporated. She didn't return to teaching. Some said it was the pain. Others whispered it was grief. She never corrected them. Let them guess. Sometimes it was easier than explaining the ache that had no language. She wandered into Willow Park more out of habit than choice. The wind tugged at her scarf, and the gray clouds overhead promised early snow. Her breath came in puffs as she crossed the old footbridge near the playground. And that's when she saw it, a flutter of movement near the rusted trash bin, something barely alive. The puppy didn't bark or growl. She simply blinked one eye half swollen, watching Grace with a resignation too old for her weeks on this earth. Grace knelt slowly, ignoring the way her knee protested. "Hey there," she whispered, holding out her hand. The puppy didn't move. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The silence between them was a strange kind of reverence. And then the puppy, with a tremble in her limbs, dragged herself forward and pressed her head into Grace's palm. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden tail wags or excited licks. Just quiet surrender. and it undid something inside Grace. She looked around. No signs, no leash, no crate. Someone had dumped this tiny creature here like yesterday's newspaper. Grace took off her scarf, gently wrapped the puppy inside, and cradled her to her chest. "I guess we're both a little lost, huh?" she murmured. At home, she placed the puppy in a basket lined with old towels. The pup didn't resist the bath, only winced once when the warm water touched her paw. Grace worked slowly, murmuring nonsense words, fingers careful not to tug too hard at the knots in the fur. She named her Daisy, not because of how she looked, but because of how she made her feel. Something about her presence whispered of spring, of new beginnings, even when the ground was cold. Later that evening, as the wind picked up and the town hunkered down against the coming chill, Grace sat beside the basket and watched Daisy sleep. There was a half-empty can of soup on the table and the flicker of a candle, the only light she'd bothered with. She didn't notice she was smiling. 3 doors down, Edna Cresswell peered out her window. A sprightly widow in her 70s, Edna had lived on Clover Street for over 4 decades. She had short silver hair always tucked under a hand-knitted cap and a personality sharp as peppermint. She'd noticed Grace walking more often lately, and now she'd seen her return with something in her arms. Edna narrowed her eyes thoughtfully and poured herself a cup of chamomile tea. "She's going to need help," Edna said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. "And I have just the cookie recipe to offer an excuse." In another part of town, Sheriff Lucas Hale sat at his desk filling out a report on illegal dumping complaints near Willow Park. He was 35 tall with a lean frame shaped by years of farm work before law enforcement. His brown hair was always a bit disheveled, and he wore a permanent squint like he was always looking into the sun. Widowed for 2 years now, he raised his 6-year-old son Ben with quiet devotion. Ben hadn't spoken in full sentences since his mother passed. No therapy had helped. Not yet. Lucas added a note to investigate the new dumping site in the park, unaware that the report was tied to a creature now fast asleep in Grace Monroe's living room. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, catching in the wind and dissolving into the fading earth. But inside, under the hum of the old radiator and the soft breath of 2 wounded souls, something had begun to thaw. Chapter 2. Footsteps in Frost. Morning in Fairview came wrapped in frost. The thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight glazed rooftops like sugar, and the bare branches of the trees sparkled in the early light. Grace stood at her kitchen window, hands curled around a chipped blue mug, watching Daisy sniff curiously at the back door. The puppy, now clean but still skinny, had more energy than the day before. Her tail wagged uncertainly, a rhythm not quite familiar with joy, yet trying its best to find it. Grace hadn't slept much. Her body was tired, but her mind had been busy. Daisy's quiet breathing in the basket, the small sighs she let out in sleep, reminded Grace of something she couldn't name, a version of herself from before the accident. One who hadn't forgotten how to hope. After feeding Daisy a mix of soft kibble and boiled chicken, Grace opened the back door. The puppy stepped out cautiously onto the small porch, nose lifted to the breeze. She took 2 steps, then bounded clumsily into the yard. Grace smiled. Across the street, Edna Cresswell was already on the move. She wore a long wool coat in emerald green, her usual knitted hat perched perfectly on her head. Under one arm, she carried a Tupperware container filled with molasses cookies. In her other hand, a folded quilt with daisy patterns sewn along the edges. Edna rang the doorbell twice. "Morning, dear," she chirped when Grace opened the door, blinking in surprise. "Thought you might appreciate something warm, both for the body and the soul." Grace accepted the gifts hesitantly, but with gratitude. Edna stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes quickly scanning the living room until they landed on Daisy. The pup was chewing the edge of an old slipper. "Well, look at that face," Edna said, crouching with a grunt and reaching a hand out. Daisy tilted her head, then crept forward to sniff the woman's fingers. "She's still nervous," Grace said softly. "Good instincts," Edna replied. "If more people were cautious with strangers, we'd have fewer problems in the world." Edna didn't ask questions. She talked about the quilt she'd made, the way her late husband used to bake cookies too hard to chew, and how the sparrows had returned to her bird bath after 3 weeks away. Grace found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like months. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office on Main Street, Lucas Hale reviewed the report about the illegal dumping again. His desk was cluttered but organized in a way that made sense to him. Family pictures sat beside folders, one of Ben at age 3 with cake all over his face, another of Lucas and his late wife Emily, smiling on their porch. Lucas touched the corner of the second photo absently. He stood pulling on his jacket, a thick canvas one lined with fleece, and headed toward Willow Park. Lucas walked the same path Grace had the morning before. The breeze pushed against his back and his boots left firm impressions in the light snow. Near the trash bin he found paw prints and the outline of what might have been a small body curled up in the cold. No fur. No blood. Just absence. He crouched, noting the direction of the tracks, and began to follow them. The trail led toward the neighborhood on the park's east side. Back on Clover Street, Ben Hale sat on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by action figures. The 6-year-old was small for his age, with light brown hair that always looked like he'd just woken up and large, watchful eyes. He didn't speak much, but he was attentive. When Lucas returned home after his shift, Ben always greeted him at the door, not with words, but with a look that asked, "Are you okay?" That morning, Ben stared out the window, watching a puppy, small and golden, chase a falling leaf in Grace Monroe's yard. His fingers clutched the curtain breath, fogging the glass. For the first time since his mother's funeral, he smiled. Grace noticed the boy at the window. She gave a small wave. The boy blinked and disappeared from view. Later that afternoon, Lucas knocked on Grace's door. Daisy barked a soft, uncertain sound and padded close to Grace's feet. Grace opened the door slowly. "Miss Monroe." Lucas asked politely, tipping his head. "I'm Sheriff Hale. There have been some reports of illegal dumping near the park. I'm checking to see if anyone saw anything unusual." Grace hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about the man's quiet tone and the way he looked her in the eye made her speak. "I found her there yesterday," she said, gesturing to Daisy. "She was freezing filthy. I didn't know who to call." Lucas crouched slightly, letting Daisy see him. She stepped forward, tail down, but wagging slowly. "Looks like she found the right person," he murmured, standing again. "I'll make a note in the file. We won't come take her or anything. Just glad she's okay." Grace nodded. She was about to thank him when Ben appeared behind his father, holding on to the hem of his coat. Lucas glanced back. "Ben, this is Miss Monroe. She's taking care of the puppy you saw." Ben said nothing, only peeked around Lucas's side to stare at Daisy. "Would you like to pet her?" Grace offered. Ben didn't respond, but he took a half step forward. Daisy, sensing the boy's gentle presence, walked toward him and sat down waiting. Ben reached out one trembling hand and laid it on her head. Grace caught her breath. Lucas swallowed hard. That's the most he's engaged with anyone in weeks." Edna watched the whole scene from her porch, her tea growing cold in her hands. "Well," she muttered to herself, "the wind's bringing change, all right." That night, Grace sat with Daisy curled beside her on the couch. She thought about the boy's hand resting on the puppy's head, the small miracle of it. The house no longer felt hollow. Outside, the stars blinked into the sky like eyes reopening after a long slumber. Somewhere deep in the earth, roots stirred beneath the frost. Chapter 3. The Scars We Can't See. The wind picked up on the third day. It came in cold gusts from the northwest, rattling window panes and pushing dry leaves across porches like restless ghosts. Inside Grace's home, the warmth of routine was slowly taking root. Daisy had begun to move more confidently around the rooms, trailing Grace like a shadow with ears. Her coat, once dull and matted, now shimmered faintly under the touch of light, though she was still thinner than she should be, and her appetite came and went unpredictably. That morning, Grace sat cross-legged on the living room floor, gently brushing Daisy's fur. The puppy's eyes blinked slowly in contentment, and her tail made lazy sweeps along the hardwood. Grace had read online about therapeutic grooming for rescue dogs. It helped rebuild trust, helped both animal and human feel a sense of safety. She found it calmed her, too. The doorbell rang. Grace paused, then stood and crossed the room. Outside stood Sheriff Lucas Hale, not in uniform today, but in a flannel shirt layered under a canvas jacket. His eyes crinkled in greeting, and beside him was Ben, bundled in a red puffer coat that made him look smaller than he was. In his gloved hands he clutched a slightly crooked paper drawing. "Hi, Lucas," said. Ben wanted to bring something. Ben looked up shyly and held out the drawing. It was a crayon sketch, Daisy sitting under a tree, her name written in large, uneven letters. Grace's throat tightened. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "Would you two like to come in?" Lucas nodded. "Just for a minute." As the three stepped inside, Daisy padded over, pausing as she spotted Ben. Her tail wagged, and Ben, emboldened, knelt down to greet her. Daisy pressed her nose into his palm, and for a fleeting second the boy let out a giggle, quiet, unsure, but real. Grace offered them both cocoa. Lucas politely declined, but Ben accepted with a shy nod. Grace noticed how Lucas kept glancing at the fireplace like the stillness of her home unsettled him. "I heard from Edna you used to teach," he said. Grace nodded. "Preschool, up until about a year ago." Lucas didn't press further. He understood the shape of silence when it was still healing. "Ben's teacher says he draws more now. He won't talk, not yet, but he listens better when she reads stories about animals." Daisy nudged Ben's leg, and the boy rested his head on her back. "You're good with her," Grace said to him. Ben looked up and gave the smallest smile. Later that evening, Grace began to worry. Daisy hadn't touched her food. She had curled up near the radiator, but trembled slightly despite the heat. Grace reached out, feeling her ears hot. Her breathing was shallow, and when she tried to lift her head, she whimpered. A wave of panic broke over Grace. She wrapped Daisy in a towel and grabbed her coat with shaking hands. The nearest veterinary clinic was 15 minutes away. She called Edna. "I can drive you," the older woman said without pause. "I'm on my way." Edna arrived in her old Ford sedan, wearing a nightgown under her coat and slippers on her feet. She didn't waste time asking questions. Grace climbed into the passenger seat, cradling Daisy close, whispering soft reassurances through gritted teeth. The clinic was run by Dr. Pamela Hargrove, a woman in her early 40s with a calm voice and sharp instincts. She had curly dark hair tucked under a bandana and moved with quiet authority. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with a tattoo of a hawk inked just under her left sleeve, a memorial to her brother who had served in the Air Force and died overseas. After a brief exam, Dr. Hargrove looked up. "She's running a high fever, likely an infection, possibly from old wounds or contaminated food before you found her. We'll need to keep her overnight." Grace's breath caught. "Will she be okay?" The vet placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's tough. She's young. You got her here in time." Edna stayed with Grace in the waiting area. They sat side by side on a bench with magazines from 5 years ago and a coffee machine that made more noise than warmth. Grace didn't speak much, just stared at the closed door Daisy had disappeared behind. "You did good," Edna finally said. Grace shook her head. "It's just a dog." "No," Edna said quietly. "It's not. She's not." They drove home in silence. Grace barely slept that night. The bed felt too big again, too cold. The next morning, Lucas stopped by unexpectedly. He noticed the dark circles under Grace's eyes before she could even speak. "She's sick," Grace said. "They're keeping her at the clinic." Lucas nodded slowly. "Ben wanted to come, but I told him we'd wait until she was feeling better." Grace tried to smile, but it crumbled halfway. That evening, Dr. Hargrove called. "She's responding to treatment. Still weak, but improving." The relief hit Grace so hard, she had to sit down. The following afternoon, Daisy came home. She was tired, moving slower, but when Ben walked over and crouched by the couch, she placed her head on his knee. He whispered something into her fur. No one heard what he said, but when he stood and looked at his dad, his voice came thin but certain. "She missed me." Lucas froze. Grace's eyes welled with tears. Ben spoke again, and again. Outside, the wind no longer howled. It whispered now, like a story learning how to begin again. Chapter 4. When a Child Speaks for the First Time. The snow had begun to melt, leaving behind slush and a hint of spring that teased Fairview with false promises. But even in the damp cold, something had changed. Grace could feel it each time Daisy stirred from her spot near the window, her movements slower but filled with alertness. The little golden retriever was recovering stubbornly quietly, just like the people who now orbited around her. At Clover Elementary, Ms. Rachel Donnelly knelt beside her students in the reading circle, her calm voice guiding them through a picture book about friendship. Rachel was in her early 30s, medium height, with soft features and copper blonde hair, often twisted up in a loose bun. Her glasses always slipped to the tip of her nose, and she had a habit of humming old country songs under her breath. She was known for her gentle firmness and the way she noticed everything, even the silences between her students. Ben Haley sat near the edge of the circle as always. He didn't participate, not yet, but his hands rested quietly in his lap, and his eyes didn't wander. Rachel had learned not to expect sudden breakthroughs. Progress came in centimeters. Until that day, they were preparing for the school's annual Share a Story Day, a tradition where each child presented something or someone that meant a lot to them. Rachel had expected Ben would skip it or maybe draw another quiet picture. But when she gently asked if there was anything he'd like to share, he met her gaze and said, "I want to talk about Daisy." Rachel blinked. "Of course, Ben." He nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation. But for Rachel, it was the beginning of something enormous. Grace was sitting on her porch swing the next day when Lucas pulled into her driveway. Daisy raised her head from the doormat and gave a single tail thump. Lucas stepped out of the truck, a hint of a grin under the stubble on his jaw. "Ben wants you to come to school tomorrow," he said. "He's going to speak." Grace blinked. In front of people, Lucas nodded. He insisted. "Only one condition Daisy has to come, too." The auditorium at Clover Elementary was modest folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, a plywood stage barely a foot high, and a curtain that squeaked when pulled. Parents and teachers filled the space with murmurs and coats slung over chairs. Daisy wore a red ribbon around her neck, slightly crooked but charming, and Grace held her leash with one hand and her nerves with the other. Rachel Donnelly waved them in from the side of the stage. "He's ready," she whispered. When it was Ben's turn, he walked onto the stage with his small shoulders squared and eyes straight ahead. He wore a blue sweater slightly too big and held a photo he had drawn Daisy with her head on his lap, stars above them like a blanket. "This is Daisy," he said into the microphone. His voice was quiet but steady. "She was sick and scared, like me." A hush fell over the room, but Grace saved her, and Daisy helped me talk again. When I was really sad, she sat with me and didn't ask for anything. She just stayed, and I started to feel safe. He turned and looked at Grace, then at Daisy, who sat just below the stage, wagging her tail slowly. "She's my best friend." The applause was immediate and filled the room like sunlight. Grace felt tears streaking her face before she realized she was crying. Lucas placed a hand gently on her shoulder. After the event, several parents approached Grace asking about Daisy, about therapy dogs, about how they might help their own children. Rachel came over too, her eyes damp. "I don't know what happened, Grace," she said. But something unlocked in him. "It wasn't me," Grace replied, wiping her eyes. "It was her." That night, as Grace sipped tea on her couch, her phone buzzed. A message from a name she didn't recognize, Tina Bergman, a freelance writer for the Fairview Journal. She'd attended the school event and was interested in doing a story. Grace hesitated. She didn't like attention. But then she looked at Daisy curled up on the floor and thought of Ben standing tall in front of a crowd. Maybe the world needed stories like that. The next day, Tina visited. She was in her late 40s, petite, with short black curls and oversized earrings that clinked when she moved. She had a voice like a warm cup of coffee, low, inviting, gently persistent. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes carefully, and knelt to pet Daisy every few minutes. I think people need this," Tina said as she packed her notebook. "We hear so much about what's broken, but this is what healing looks like." Grace nodded, unsure of what to say. The article came out a week later, "The Dog Who Helped a Boy Speak Again." It featured a photo of Ben with Daisy, his hand resting lightly on her head, his face calm. The story spread through town like wildfire. Strangers stopped Grace at the grocery store. A woman dropped off a bag of toys and dog treats at her front porch. Even Edna received a batch of thank you for encouraging Grace muffins. Lucas stopped by that weekend with a letter in hand. From the district, he said, "They want to talk to you about starting a community animal program, therapy training, outreach." They read the article. Grace held the letter like it was made of porcelain. She looked at Daisy. What do you think girl Daisy wagged her tail in response? Chapter 5. Spring was always waiting. By early March, Fairview had shed its final traces of winter. The snow melted into rivulets that carved lazy trails through sidewalks and gutters. Trees began to bud in hesitant green, and birds returned like old friends, whispering songs in morning light. On Grace Monroe's porch, a new wooden sign hung beside the door, painted by hand in shades of sunflower yellow and sky blue. The Daisy Project, Pet Healing and Companionship. Grace hadn't planned on launching a community program. It had grown like a vine organically insistently through every kind conversation, every letter dropped into her mailbox, every child who now knocked shyly on her door to meet the dog that helped a boy speak again. She had spent long evenings with Sheriff Lucas Hale going over paperwork, local funding proposals, and background checks. Lucas had a quiet talent for simplifying bureaucracy, and his presence, steady grounded, became something Grace looked forward to more than she admitted. Ben, for his part, came over after school almost every day. He and Daisy had become inseparable. He still spoke little in public, but his voice had grown stronger at home. He read aloud now, first picture books, then chapter books, with Daisy nestled by his feet, tail gently tapping in rhythm. Grace stood that morning beside the wide community center doors, holding Daisy's leash and watching the small crowd gather. She wore jeans and a soft flannel shirt under a denim jacket, her short chestnut hair tucked behind her ears. A few light laugh lines crinkled at the edges of her eyes, the kind that appeared after real healing had begun. Inside the center folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle. A table stood to one side with homemade muffins, courtesy of Edna Cresswell, who now considered herself honorary PR manager, hot cider, and a donation jar with paw prints painted on it. Today was their first official pet healing session, a meet and greet for families interested in therapy visits. Among those who arrived was Tommy Ellison, a retired truck driver in his late 60s with a limp from an old injury and eyes clouded by early glaucoma. He had thinning gray hair and wore a battered denim vest full of patches from every state he had driven through. His wife had passed 2 winters ago, and since then, Tommy mostly sat on his porch talking to a photo. He approached Daisy with quiet hands and a voice that cracked. "You don't mind if I sit, do you?" Daisy walked to him and placed her head on his knee. Tommy didn't speak for 10 full minutes. Then he whispered, "You remind me of my old girl." Her name was Betty. She liked to dance when no one was looking. A few chairs away, Morgan Sinclair, a mother of twins, sat nervously. She was tall, mid-30s with tightly curled brown hair and eyes that never stayed in one place for long. Her sons Jamie and Jonah were both on the autism spectrum, and noise overwhelmed them easily. When Daisy approached, they froze, but the pup simply sat a short distance away, curling up silently. Jamie crawled forward first, placing a cautious hand on her back. Jonah followed. Neither child spoke, but both began to smile. Lucas arrived midway through the session, his uniform replaced by a casual jacket. He carried 2 extra leashes, just in case. When Grace caught his eye, he winked. The sight of him relaxed, grounded, made her heart do strange things she hadn't felt in years. As the session wound down, Edna clapped her hands and suggested a group photo. Families lined up under the banner Daisy had signed with a painted paw print. Grace stood with Lucas on one side, Ben on the other, Daisy in the middle. Someone snapped the picture just as Ben leaned down and whispered, "You're the bravest girl I know." A week later, the photo went semi-viral after being shared by a regional news station. Emails flooded in, messages from other towns, questions about starting similar programs. Grace received one letter written in careful cursive from an elderly woman in Oregon. "My grandson hasn't spoken in months. Do you think a dog like Daisy could help us too?" As the days passed, Grace found herself speaking again at schools, invited to town halls, and even recording a short video for a statewide community outreach program. Daisy, always calm, always gentle, walked beside her through it all. One evening, Grace and Lucas sat on her porch with mugs of tea as the sun slipped behind the horizon. Ben was inside helping Edna organize books into a new lending shelf Grace had added to the front entryway. It was Edna's idea, naturally. Every good space needs stories. Lucas looked over his mug. "You ever think about going back to teaching?" Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "Maybe I never really stopped. Just changed classrooms." Lucas nodded. "We've been doing some thinking about the 3 of us." Grace raised an eyebrow. Ben asked if Daisy could stay over, not just visit. Her breath caught. "I know it's early," Lucas said, "but this feels real, not forced, like a house we could build together." Grace looked toward the window. Inside, Ben knelt beside Daisy, reading from a book about stars. She nodded slowly. "Let's take it one season at a time." Spring arrived for real the following week. Daffodils pushed through the earth like small yellow trumpets. Birds nested in the eaves. Grace woke each day not to silence, but to sound soft barking kettle whistles, Ben's laughter. The home that once held only shadows now pulsed with light. Daisy would never remember the day she was thrown away, or the cold hunger of her earliest hours, but her body remembered healing. Her paws remembered warmth, and her heart, like the hearts of those around her, learned not just to survive but to bloom. Sometimes the ones who rescue us don't come with sirens or grand gestures. They come on quiet paws and soft silences, and with eyes that simply stay. Daisy wasn't just a puppy left behind. She was a reminder that love, when given a chance, can heal what the world has broken. In our own lives, we often walk past pain we don't see. Maybe it's the lonely man next door, or a child who hasn't found their voice yet. But what if hope lives in the smallest acts, in showing up and listening in, staying even when it's hard? Let this story remind us we don't need to be perfect to change someone's life. We just need to be present. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment to let us know how Daisy's journey moved you, and if you believe in the quiet miracles of love, type Amen below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true stories that prove healing is possible even for those the world tried to throw away. May God bless you, and may your days be filled with kindness, courage, and companions who never give up on you.